DeMar DeRozan is having a first-team All-NBA caliber season. He might not make first-team All-NBA, but that's kind of a different story altogether. He's putting up career highs pretty much across the board for the best team in the East, a team that also has dealt with a ton of protocol issues and lost Patrick Williams at the start of the season. DeRozan, even with the Bulls' other offseason additions, is the biggest differentiator between past Bulls teams, that quite frankly were barely relevant, to this version of the Bulls that is a legit finals contender. And you know what's crazy? I talk about basketball for a living, and I have for years, with a huge focus on free agency, offseason moves, and roster construction. And I was totally wrong about how DeMar would fit in Chicago. He went from one of the biggest overpays of the offseason, in my opinion, to a legitimate MVP candidate in the first half of his first season with the Bulls. So yeah, I was wrong about DeMar DeRozan, but you know what else? Everybody else was too. So why has DeMar been so good in Chicago as a player that we've always known was really good, but has never made it to this kind of level, especially in terms of his impact on winning? Well, first of all, DeMar's always been a really good player. There might have been some advanced numbers that didn't look kindly on him, or people didn't like the fact that he couldn't space, or early in his career in Toronto, that he was a very isolation-heavy player. But strictly from a skill set standpoint, DeMar DeRozan has always been very good. But people like myself, as well as a lot of other people, just did not like the way that his game fit alongside other players. DeMar DeRozan was someone that you kind of needed to build your team around in those early years in Toronto. It was very ISO heavy, a lot of mid-range jump shots and mid-range post-ups, and he just wasn't a very good playmaker. He was your typical old school scoring two guard that did not space the floor at all, which just made it very difficult to create a team around him, which is kind of crazy to think about him being someone that's difficult to play with after we've seen how well he's played with everyone in Chicago. But probably the biggest point in DeMar's development was when he ended up in San Antonio. He was really upset about being traded as part of the Kawhi Leonard trade and Toronto moving on from him, but it probably ended up being one of the best things for him in his career. He gets to San Antonio and his game begins to shift and morph in his few years there, where he's no longer such an isolation heavy player, becomes more of a player that is on the ball but is creating in ball screens, becomes a much better playmaker, and his spacing issues still persist. He's still not an off-ball spacer, but everything else about his game offensively is completely devastating. Adding that playmaking piece opened up so many things. It made the mid-range jumpers easier. He got to the rim more, and it was such a key part of what helped him become a better all-around player offensively. So in San Antonio, his percentages went up, his assists went up. The Spurs just didn't really win that many games because they really just weren't all that talented over his couple years in San Antonio, but those years were critical to his development as he moved forward into Chicago. And he gets to a Chicago team that was in a very aggressive team building mode. They had traded for Vucevic the prior season. They were bringing in all these other guys throughout the offseason, and DeMar seemed like the last piece of the puzzle. And when Chicago brought him in, I was skeptical. I looked at this roster and I thought they could be interesting. I thought they'd finish somewhere between the 6 and the 10 spot in the Eastern Conference, but I didn't see the offensive upside. I certainly didn't see their ability to defend at all. And I didn't think that DeMar was someone that was really going to raise the ceiling of their group very much. I still viewed him as someone that was not going to be very effective off the ball because of his limitations as a spacer. I questioned whether or not him and Zach LaVine together was going to work in terms of each of them being able to share the basketball. And I've been completely wrong, because what ended up happening is DeMar became the number one guy in this offense. And I just didn't view him as that when Chicago brought him in. I thought it was going to be a lot of LaVine still, as it had been for the last couple of seasons. And then DeMar would have to play off the ball way more than he has. And that would cause issues for their spacing. And it's just, everything has fit shockingly perfectly. The spacing around DeMar works so well with his game. LaVine's one of the best off-ball spacers in the league. Lonzo's a really good shooter. They have Vucevic who can space for him as well. They have good defenders. And everything ended up being a perfect fit. And I think that says more about Chicago and the moves that they made around DeMar than necessarily anything about DeMar himself. No disrespect to how awesome he's been to begin this year. But that leads me to probably the biggest thing that I, as well as a lot of other people, miss about DeMar's transition to Chicago, and that is the position that he was going to play. When they brought him in, and they brought in all these other players in the offseason, I envisioned a lineup that included Lonzo Ball, Zach LaVine, DeMar, Patrick Williams at the 4, and then Vucevic at the 5, with Caruso being the main guy coming off the bench. That was what I kind of envisioned for their lineup. However, DeMar DeRozan, to this point in the season, per Cleaning the Glass, has played a whopping 74% of his minutes at the 4 spot. Now, granted, when you go back and look at his season immediately prior in San Antonio, he played almost 70% of his minutes at the 4 in San Antonio as well, another team that has a significant amount of guards. However, when I looked at the roster in Chicago, I thought DeMar fit nicely at the 3 spot, and in every season prior to his final one in San Antonio, DeMar played the vast majority of his minutes at either the 2 or the 3. So I kind of thought that time in San Antonio, that last year, was just kind of a statistical anomaly given the roster makeup of that team. And in Chicago, he would slide to the 3. That has not been the case at all, and it's been fantastic for DeMar being able to play at the 4. Now, granted, Patrick Williams getting hurt, who would have been the 4 to start games, and they would have been able to shuffle the lineups from there, has probably pushed DeMar into even more minutes at the 4 than he would have played otherwise, which likely has been good for Chicago in the long term. Not that you ever want someone like Patrick Williams to get hurt, but positionally, the 4 is where DeMar belongs. It allows the Bulls to play all their other guards that are really good. It allows them to play Caruso, Paul, LaVine, a ton of minutes in the backcourt, a little bit of LaVine at the 3, DeMar at the 4, whatever big they want to put on the floor. And then they have all the spacing. They have all the defense that they need. They're able to get out in transition, and DeMar just destroys players that try to guard him at the 4. I thought that initial lineup that I mentioned earlier would work pretty well. I just really questioned if they had the depth to make things work, but I thought they had a couple of good offensive players, a couple of plus defenders in that starting lineup, but things have shifted dramatically for them, and that's the biggest thing that I got wrong. I read DeMar's final season in San Antonio from a positional standpoint as an anomaly statistically rather than the norm, where he's going to be playing the 4 almost every single minute that he's on the floor. And him being at the 4 opens everything up. It lessens the concerns about his spacing because he can play closer to the rim off the ball if he wants to. His numbers from 3 are actually pretty decent this year. He doesn't shoot them very often, but he's shooting a decent percentage. But it helps that he isn't as much of a liability off the ball spacing wise. And when he's on the ball with all the spacing they put on the floor, he can attack in post ups if he gets a switch. He can attack in the mid range. He can get to the rim. Everything else works better with him there. And it's been a fantastic adjustment for Chicago, which leads me to people being wrong. Quite frankly, I thought it was one of the biggest overpays of the offseason when they brought him in. Not only that they traded assets for him, but that they signed him to the big contract. I didn't like the money at his age. I didn't really like the fit. And I thought that DeMar as a player, quite frankly, I did not think he was worth as much money as they were going to be paying him. I was wrong about what position he would play and how that would affect the rest of the team. I was wrong about the fact that Zach LaVine would be willing to be a second option offensively. And I was wrong about how good the Bulls as a whole would be defensively, which has led to them being the best team in the Eastern Conference to begin the season. But here's the thing. Nobody saw this coming. That's what makes this so cool, is that nobody thought that DeMar was going to be this good or that the Bulls were going to be this good. There's not a single person you can find out there that said, I think DeMar is going to be an MVP candidate and the Bulls are going to be the 1 seed. Nobody thought that. The most optimistic of people about the Chicago team saw them as a top 3 seed. That's a really good fourth quarter scoring team because of the offensive options between DeMar and LaVine. They figure some things out defensively, and they're just a devastating offensive team. And that was their path towards becoming a really good team. But specific to DeMar, not a single person thought he would be a first-team All-NBA caliber guy at 32 years old. And not that he's been bad in the past. He's made All-NBA teams. He's made All-Star teams. But this is a completely different level for DeMar. And it's a large combination of factors. It's the situation in Chicago. It's the players they've surrounded him with. It's the position that he's now playing, carried over from his time in San Antonio, where he's really allowed to develop as a playmaker and an on-ball guy, with some carryover from his initial years in Toronto, where he's still a very good isolation scorer, an incredible mid-range player as well. And all those things in combination have led us to a rarity in the NBA. And that is a player late in their career, in their low 30s, having the best season of their career from a statistical standpoint, as well as from a team success standpoint. And I'm hoping that this continues into the playoffs, because we know in the past, DeMar has had some struggles in the postseason in his time in Toronto. And I'm hoping that this Chicago team can continue this momentum. Maybe they get Patrick Williams back at some point during the season, and DeMar can continue to be awesome in the playoffs, because it has been one of the best stories to come out of the NBA in the last couple of years. His career resurgence has been awesome, and I'll admit it, just like everybody else, I was totally wrong about DeMar.